Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you may have tuned in. Welcome to today's Dark Reading event, Modern Supply Chain Security, Integrated, Interconnected, and Context-Driven, sponsored by Apiro and broadcast by Informa. Terry Sweeney here with Dark Reading. I'll be your moderator today. Today's featured speaker, Idan Plotnick, co-founder and CEO of Apiro, will be making a case that application security solutions must be deeply integrated with an organization's AppSec programs to overcome the shortcomings of otherwise siloed approaches. He'll discuss the elements of holistic supply chain security, as well as the key components of a modern supply chain security solution. Idan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And we will talk about today the modern software supply chain security, how it needs to be integrated, interconnected, and risk-based, context-driven. We will cover why, okay, and the definition of software supply chain. We'll talk about the problems with the current solution, how to solve it by integrating software security solution, software supply chain security solution with ASPM, the Application Security Posture Management, and what's our approach to a deep application security posture management. So let's start with why and the definition of software supply chain security. So we think about it as everything that assembled an application, the components, the processes, the systems, tools that make up the application. And it all started from the source. Like in the source, you have proprietary code that you develop. You have configuration files. You have the open source packages that your developers are bringing in. And eventually, the source control managers that stores, maintain, track the changes, and allow you to develop in agile methodologies. So you have not only the code itself and the open source, but also what store this code. At the build stage, you have the CI/CD pipelines and the container registries that helps you eventually take the code that you developed, build it, and make it ready for deployment. At the deploy phase, we have what we call, and now also part of the Cyclone DX framework, it's extended SBOM. SBOM is a list of all your open source dependencies, but now you need to extend it to contain all the things that assemble the application. As I said, all the components, processes, systems, and tools. So now at the deploy phase, we generate an XBOM. You also have the code governance and signature, and eventually the artifact repositories that stores everything that you packaged and build, so it will be ready to deliver to the cloud. So now let's dive a little bit more about the why. So software supply chains are the lifeblood of every modern application development. And we saw it, how it's being assembled, but nowadays, almost every enterprise, more than 60% of the enterprise today, are using CI/CD pipelines to improve the time to market and the delivery of code and applications to their cloud. And more than 78% of the code bases are actually made up of open source components. While we understand that this is a core fundamental in the way you develop and build and deliver applications to the cloud, the software supply chain attacks are still on the rise. And the regulatory compliance that we have right now are getting more and more stringent. More than 700% increase of the attacks in the last 3 years. And more than $100 billion dollars in a global annual cost is predicted by 2031. So let's double click on the attacks and the regulatory compliance a little bit. So I'm not going to talk in depth because everyone heard about SolarWinds, Log4j, and code-to-runtime, but in very high level, the attack on the software supply chain at SolarWinds actually breached the CI/CD pipeline, which is the infrastructure that builds the code, but also injected code into the application and proprietary code that was part of an update. So it's a combination between attack on your build and code, as well as we saw how we define software supply chain, not only we, the market. Log4j was at the application layer, but it was a logging framework that being used across many organizations across the world, and it was exposed to the internet. And this is why the impact of the Log4j and Log4Shell vulnerability was such a big thing. And same goes for code-to-runtime, which is a code coverage tool used by more than 30,000 companies around the world. And the last point here is, because of the magnitude of these attacks, now it's a board level discussion conversation. How we protect against it, what we are doing, do we have visibility, and more and more. And the last thing around why software supply chain is the regulations. Because of these, the exponential growth in the attacks, we now have regulatory compliances that are more and more detailed and more hard to comply with. So it's across, like we have SALSA, CIS, and NIST. SALSA talks about the source, build, and package. CIS talks about the source code, the build pipeline, the dependencies, the artifacts, and the deployment, with more than 100 recommendations, very detailed recommendations. And we have NIST 800-161 and 800-204D, which is a strategy of how to integrate the software supply chain security into the DevSecOps processes and the CI/CD pipelines. And these requirements, we see them more and more and more, not only in the large enterprises, but also in the mid-market as well. So just to summarize why software supply chain security is so important. One, the exponential growth in attacks. Two, the regulatory compliance. We listed the top three, but here you can see more, like PCI and the US executive order and the SBOM requirements. And the last one is how the impact, the personal impact on the liability of these attacks. We saw the SolarWinds CISO, it being held by like liable for 2020 attack in ongoing lawsuit in the SEC. And we will see more and more cases like that in the future. So now let's talk about the problem. So we understand what software supply chain means. We understand what are the drivers or why businesses will want to deploy a solution that will cover both the protection and secure their environment from attacks, but also to comply with the regulations. But let's talk about the two main challenges that we identify by working with a lot of customers on the software supply chain security. The first one is you have siloed tools. A lot of vendors tackling only pieces of the software supply chain, only protecting the containers, or only the CI/CD pipeline, or the source control manager. And this leads to tool overload and cost of maintenance and the deployment of these tools. The second challenge around these siloed tools create is that now we we have a gap between what the AppSec sees. They see different alerts, and the people that manages the software supply chain security tools see different alerts. And then you have gaps in risk because these alerts are connected and combined and can create a toxic combination. The second challenge is that we have disconnected teams. The AppSec wants visibility into the software supply chain that builds the code that they own to secure, but it's maintained by DevOps. And most of these software security supply chain solutions are managed and they're geared towards the DevOps. And this creates a big silo between the AppSec team and the DevOps team, and in some cases, the development teams. This leads to one, manual work from the AppSec to understand their software supply chain attack surface. Two, it creates gap and expose the business to risks and liability. And eventually, it's almost impossible to comply with these compliance requirements. Why? Because if you have a silo tool, this silo tools analyze only pieces of the information. And they cannot, and the requirements actually ask you to comply with code and build and deploy together. And then you need to stitch siloed data points from different silo tools to be able to comply with these standards. But the fundamental problem, or not problem, the fundamental fact is that application risk is interconnected. It's a graph. It's not a list of all your alerts from these silo tools. The application risk is connected on one graph, and let's see it in a step-by-step, okay? So first, we have source code in Java that contains RESTful APIs. Now, the SAST solution scans the code and identifies SQL injection, but doesn't connect the dots to a RESTful API. Now you have an open source package that your SCA solution identified RCE, remote code execution. And then you have a developer that someone stole his identity and commit malicious code, and you have an abnormal behavior. And then you have a breach to your CI/CD pipeline, which identified by different tool. And then you have a secret that was added to your code by a developer and is detected by a secret detection tool. But all of that is connected. This API actually exposes sensitive data like PII from one of the data models in the code. And these are all connected to the same code module with high business impact that transfer money. And then this code module is actually part of a code repo that is being built and deployed by the CI/CD pipeline that was breached. And eventually this gets into an artifact and runs in a container in your Kubernetes cluster. Now let's talk about the teams and the tools that are siloed, okay? The first one, let's take on one hand, on the left side, you have the supply chain, the software supply chain. It's implemented, maintained, and administered by the DevOps team. And as we said, you have different tools. You have the branch protection in your GitHub security. You have the Jenkins misconfiguration from a different tool. You have the containers from a different tool. And then you have siloed alerts from different tools that is managed by the DevOps team. Now you have the application, the code itself. So you have the application security engineers that deployed their SAST and SCA and DAST and API security and secret scanning. And these are all siloed and noisy. And then these application security teams are saying, we need to understand the attack surface across the software supply chain, what builds the code that we own and responsible for the security of this code. And these teams are not working together with different UIs, different data points. And this is a huge, huge problem that eventually leads us to different signals. So you have so many different alerts from these tools across different teams, which create siloed or gaps in risks that you need to detect. And then you need to prioritize and eventually remediate these alerts. And to do that, the responsibility of that is some of it, it's on the developers. Some of the responsibility is on the DevOps side. And some of that is on the application security, or in some cases, it's shared responsibility, which makes it much harder and complex. So what is the solution? The solution is to unify the ASPM, the Application Security Posture Management, and the software supply chain security tools together in one platform. And it's based on the Gartner recommendations from their last ASPM documentation. So what does it mean? 3 main buckets. It needs to be integrated. You need single pane of glass of all the application and software supply chain components and their associated risk to unified visibility in risk in one place. Then you need interconnected approach. You need to be able on the graph to identify that this alert is connected to this alert and combine these chained application and software supply chain security risks to be able to close gaps that you have today across the threats and also the compliance. And lastly, you need a risk-based approach and context-driven to be able to prioritize all these alerts. You need to leverage a deep code-to-runtime context and analysis to prioritize these application risks and software supply chain risks together based on the same likelihood and impact factors to reduce the noise and save time of triaging all these alerts. And this integrated ASPM platform enables AppSec teams and development teams to, 1, reduce the AppSec and the software supply chain risks without deploying more silo tools, without maintaining yet another tools, without wasting money of yet another tools. 2 is to eliminate the gaps, the risks that left by these siloed solutions. And 3, reduce the manual work. A lot of manual work is being done to assess the risk, to prioritize, and remediate across the application code, the open source code, the source control manager, and the pipelines risks as well. So let's see how Apiro solves this problem. So what we built, and I will dive a little bit more on the visibility part, is we built a complete inventory, application inventory across the design, the code, the build, and the deploy, and enrich context from runtime. In one inventory, we build an extended SBOM across all your APIs in the code and authentication framework, and I will talk about this in details. The second piece is we build a risk graph that actually connects all the components in the inventory and the associated risks in one graph that allows you to prioritize, remediate, and also prevent these risks with our control plane. So you have one risk control plane across your development lifecycle and across your software supply chains. And it allows you to get one dashboard to measure everything, all the risk process that you have right now to prioritize and fix. You can measure and govern in one place. And you have an automated risk profile that you don't need to manually go and run risk assessment questionnaires before you deploy to production. So let's double click on the integrated visibility, what we called XBOM, extended SBOM, which was adopted by Cyclone DX format. So on the application side, we map all the code modules, all the frameworks, the logging, the serialization frameworks. We understand if you're developing a backend or a front-end application. We list all your APIs in the code, all the SDKs and frameworks, and all the GenAI frameworks and code usage in your repositories. Then we map all the security controls, all the encryption, authorization, input validation, and key management. On the development side, we map and maintain audit trail across material changes on all languages, utilities, testing frameworks, open source packages, and open source licenses. On the data side, we actually analyzes all the data models, all the data store connection, the data access objects. We automatically identify PII, PCI, and PHI in your code bases. We map all the containers, the pipeline, the API gateways, the infrastructure as code, the repositories, and the cloud providers that you are using in your code bases. And eventually, we assess the risk of every material change. We identify risk or ingest risk from your current siloed solutions across infrastructure as code, secrets, vulnerability, exposure of sensitive data in the code, pipeline misconfiguration, and licenses issues. So this is an extended SBOM that actually allows you to understand what assemble your application. The second, the last piece is the interconnected approach. How we automatically identified a toxic combination, okay? And let's give 3 examples of toxic combination. Let's say we identify a secret in your applicative code, not in test code, code that will reach production. Then we ask, is it actually, based on the likelihood and impact factors, is it in a public repo? Is it in a code modules with PII data and maybe has a high business impact? Is the secret is actually deployed or not? Is it being used in the production environment? This is a toxic combination. Siloed alerts that are connected together that makes the impact of the risk much higher. The second example is we have an open source dependency with RC vulnerability. But is it actually being used and reachable in the code? Is it deployed? Is it in a shared module and then I have a blast radius? Maybe I can fix one alert that will close 100 risks. And is it actually being exposed to the internet? Another example on the application code is I have a RESTful API in Java. It exposes PII with SQL injection. Is it deployed and internet exposed? These are toxic combinations that Apiro can identify. And then we take this context and we power the prioritization and take it to the extreme. We take, for example, from a real environment, 150,000 alerts or findings. And based on our risk calculation, we took it to 400 critical risks. Why? Because the likelihood of the risk is, as I said, is it being used in the code, being deployed, exposed to the internet? These are 12% of the risk. And only 2.2% of the risk are in high business impact repositories, in shared code modules with toxic combination and with repos that has PII data. And we calculate all these likelihood and impact factors automatically without any human intervention. So just to sum up the benefits of adopting an integrated, interconnected, and risk-based approach to software supply chain security solution. You automate the manual process, you enhance security, you improve compliance. You can actually connect the dots across the source code, the build, and the deploy to give you one compliance view. And you get deeper visibility into all the process, the SDLC processes, and the tools and infrastructure that allow you to build and deploy your code to the cloud. Thank you very much, and let's go through a Q&A.
Thanks, Idan. That's a welcome new cut into the issues surrounding software supply chain security, which, as you noted, has been the topic of certainly lots of hand-wringing, but also headlines and, to your point, investment by both vendors as well as organizations in need of them. Predictably, your presentation has generated a few questions. Just as a reminder to our audience, though, to participate in the Q&A, just type your question into the text box located to the right of the presentation window, or just click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If we don't get to your question during today's webinar, we'll be sharing them with our speaker who can reply to you offline. I'd also like to direct your attention to the webinar survey that's available at the bottom of the presentation window. Thanks in advance for filling this out. Your feedback provides us direction for how to improve future events. Thank you for that. Idana, some good questions here. We've got a question with regard to visibility and to what degree application security posture management maintains a real-time inventory. Is this something that organizations need to keep up to date? Tell us a bit more about that.
Sure. So first and foremost, PCI for section 6.3.2 talks explicitly about the importance of an or the mandatory requirements for an inventory across third-party software and custom software that you build internally. So it's a key, but by the way, not only PCI, other regulatory requirements, and explicitly in the financial industry, you have internal controls that requires you to maintain an up-to-date inventory. Unfortunately, most of these inventories are maintained based on manual questionnaires or manual processes, gates that you need to go through when you deploy software, before you deploy software to production. In some cases, in the financial industry, it's even before you start the development of a new application or start the development of a new feature or a material change, what it's being called in the financial industry. Having said that, this is, I think, the core, let's say, differentiator of Apiro versus other ASPM solution. We actually analyzes the source code and the open source code and the configuration files to translate code into entities and then store them in an inventory and track the material changes across of them. So for example, you don't need to manually ask me, hey, Idan, did you introduce new PII data to this application? Or are you going to deploy to add PII or sensitive APIs or maybe new authentication framework or a new database to this application? No, you don't need to do that anymore. You just need a smarter ASPM that actually can not only allow you to build the inventory manually and maintain it, but actually keep up to date for every code commit, for every change. And this is a big, big thing for our customers. This was, I think, the main driver why we got such large enterprises using Apiro. This was the main catalyst. And I also want to say that this inventory not only complies with regulatory standards, it allows the AppSec engineers to understand what their developers are doing and map the attack surface, and they're much more educated and knowledgeable. So we empower the AppSec engineers, and we saved time in these manual interactions. So this is why we see inventory as a regulatory compliant, but also a business enabler to the business.
Thanks for that. We have another question about risk assessment. Can ASPM identify other things that are going on in the development process that may either add risk or make an organization more susceptible to an attack?
So risk assessment is a very complex process, okay? And it's totally different from one organization to another, okay? I can tell you without exposing customer names, we have a customer that before using Apiro had in his risk assessment for a new application, 400 questions. And for a material change in this risk assessment, 100 questions. So it's different from one to another. But to make a long story short, the risk assessment contains not only vulnerabilities, but questions like, did you change a very, the code that actually passes sensitive data to a third-party organization? Or did you change the code that actually pass money from one entity to another? So these risk assessment questionnaires or processes are a combination between identifying vulnerabilities, but also identifying design flaws. What I'm not sure all of our audience are aware, but you have the OWASP A04, which talks about the implication of insecure design. So to be able to comply with this requirements, you need to do the risk assessment. So just to make a long story short, it's a combination of identifying vulnerabilities and identifying design flaws and identifying material changes that needs to go through a pen testing process or a design review process. And we at Apiro, we automate it so you don't need the manual process, the manual risk assessment process.
Okay. Another question. Our pipeline security is a shared responsibility between our security team and DevOps. How does something like this help us work better together? This really cuts to the heart of, I think, what we're talking about here. Where vulnerability and management and risk like it all just sort of converges here, doesn't it?
Yes, and unfortunately, first and foremost is a complex topic, and this question we can spend 2 hours on it. But it's, look at it, as I said in my presentation, it's different tools, different people, and in some cases, it's not only the people that owns, like you said, shared responsibility, or the audience said shared responsibility. In some cases, you have the security team that owns the part of it, and you have the DevOps, but you also have a different team for vulnerability management. And this team that gets all the vulnerabilities into this one solution doesn't have the context, the deep context of the code, and doesn't understand it's not yet another alert from your endpoint where you need to combine between email and malicious process and identity. It's much more complex than that. So I just want to say that you need a feedback loop with automation around these workflows. So you need to gather context, and then you need to pass the relevant context to the relevant persona. with the root cause analysis, identify the code owners, okay, and then bring them into the loop to be able to help reduce the MTTR, the mean time to remediation, but provide these security teams and DevOps the context that is missing for them to be able to fix, to prioritize and fix the problem. I think this is a very, very complex topic. I can tell you from my personal experience as a GM for software engineering at Microsoft back then, after the acquisition of my previous startup, it was a big problem in 2017, 18, and it's still a huge, huge challenge today with large enterprises that we are working with. As I said, we tried to solve this problem by building a very deep inventory, map it to the code owners, every code component. We know when it's being deployed, where it's being deployed, who maintained the pipeline, who is the code owner for this SQL injection or log4j, and we have an automatic workflow that takes all these data points, calculate them, the risk, and then pass them to the relevant people so they don't need to send Slack message and ask, hey, who is this owner for this API or this open source dependency, and where it's being deployed, and so on and so forth. So this is how we tried to stitch all the data points together across team, across risks, and automatically find the code owners for them.
Thanks for that. Our last question is a multi-part question. The questioner is asking, can ASPM help us align with or comply better to regulations, and how would something like that work? If so, like, what are some of the benefits they could then expect?
Yes, of course. So again, everything is around the data. So to be able to comply with a regulatory framework like SALSA, PCI, CIS, and NIST, you need to, unfortunately, go and first translate these controls into your internal controls. This is a big, big challenge for risk management teams, and we can codify them in Apiro. 2, you need to now collect different data sources to be able to say, hey, I have something in my code, and then something in my pipeline, and then something in my container registry. And what we try to do, again, is stitch these data points in one place where you can define your guardrails. And in most cases, you can automate and say, I'm compliant with these requirements or not. And eventually, if you have a breach of compliance, or you are committing code or making a material change, implementing a material change that will breach your compliance, then we can put guardrails and say, you don't have permit to build, or you don't have a permit to deploy, and automatically go and ask Terry to review it because he's the risk owner for this application.
Well, that's a good place for us to stop today. That's all the time we have for questions. Idam Plotnik, thank you. Dark Reading appreciates your time and expertise on modern supply chain security that's smartly integrated with AppSec. Thanks, Idam. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you as well to our sponsor, Apiro, as well as to everyone in the audience. We appreciate your attention and participation. This webinar is copyright 2023 by Informa. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted by Dark Reading and Apiro. The individual speaker is solely responsible for their content and their opinions. On behalf of our guest, Apiro, Terry Sweeney here with Dark Reading, thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.